Well, I wonder whether we should get started introducing what we're all here for this evening. Well, I say this evening, obviously, seeing the geographic spread of people, it's not this evening for everyone, and certainly not for my two special guests, Jason and Zhamak. So what we're here to discuss today is federated computational governance, which is an aspect of data mesh. So data mesh is a paradigm shift in big analytical data management that aims to address some of the, I guess, the failure modes or problems with previous generations of analytical data management. I won't attempt to go into it too far because Zhamak Dehghani, who's here, is going to explain what data mesh as a whole is about before we dive into the data governance and the governance aspect of data mesh specifically. So welcome to everyone. If you're interested in governance and data governance, you're in the right place. It's really nice to see a mixture of people, backgrounds in the chat. I think probably more than many other things, this is a cross-disciplinary question because people who are involved in data governance come from various walks of life, from software development to the governance side of things. And we hope that by having both Jason and Zhamak here today, we'll achieve a bit of a balance of that perspective. Zhamak, do you want to, oh no, you've already brought up our faces. Cool, so my name's Chris Ford. I'm the head of technology for Thoughtworks Spain. So my background is in organizations and how to structure things so that people doing technical things can do them really well and have a good environment to do their best work. Zhamak, who I'll introduce as well, she works for Thoughtworks as the Director of Emerging Technologies in North America. And she has a focus on distributed systems and big data architecture. But she's here today because she's the, I was about to say creator, but I guess you could also say discoverer or namer of data mesh. And she did that in 2018 and has been speaking about that and writing articles and maybe soon a book as well on that topic. So we also have Jason, who's our data governance subject matter expert for today. He works as an enterprise data governance subject matter expert with leadership experience developing data governance and programs for government agencies at local, national, federal, and international level. So he's an ITIL and CDMP in data governance, so he can authentically represent that point of view and that set of interests from the data governance world. So what I might do is that we'll start by having a presentation from Zhamak on what data mesh is in general to keep you oriented on the big picture, so the purpose of the approach in general. Then what Zhamak will do, we'll dive deeper into data mesh's take on governance. And then once we've got that as a frame for the discussion, Jason, Zhamak, and I will have a chat about how to balance the different point of views and interests in governance in a new data mesh world. So if you don't mind, Zhamak, take it away.
Thank you. For folks who have attended our previous webinar on this series, you might be familiar with some of this content, but for folks who are new, I thought I'd just set the context. What is data mesh and what is data mesh governance? Why we have a pillar there. So in summary, data mesh is really a socio-technical approach. It's a decentralized approach in managing and accessing data for analytical use cases at scale. And there's a few words that I highlight here. By the way, definitions are really hard. Naming things is really hard. And then having definitions is even harder. It's easy to explain things that define them, but this is the best definition I could come up with. Data mesh started as really an architectural perspective and technical architecture perspective. But very quickly, I mean, folks who've been dealing with architecture at enterprise level, you realize that you cannot talk about architecture without talking about people, organization, incentives, the relationship of people and stakeholders, programmers, users with the architecture. So very quickly, this turned into a socio-technical, as in an approach that focuses on technical excellence in architecture, but also the relationship and facilitating how people work with the technology. Hence, the governance becomes an aspect. Hence, the organizational structure becomes an aspect that we talk about under the umbrella of data mesh. But there is a bit of a maybe question here as why we talk about scale again. I mean, we have solved the problem of scale with regard to data over the last few a couple of decades. So we've had, the early 2000s with every business becoming digital and web oriented and generating a lot of data. We saw the problem of scale, and we had distributed file systems, MapReduce, Hadoop, that whole ecosystem got created to deal with the scale and volume of data. So we solved that problem, right? And then we had the concern around the scale of variety of data. So it wasn't just that we had relational structured data. We found ourselves very quickly with semi-structured, with text and voice and video and imaging, and all of this data now became useful because we could put the data into action, right? So then we had the variety, the birth of the blob storage and lakes and technologies that lend itself with dealing with the volume, with the diversity, scaling diversity. With every, with us moving from kind of the desktops and to mobiles and devices and sensors and mobiles, kind of providing a large body of data with high velocity, we had to deal with velocity. So then we had, the kind of messaging and kind of stream processing became a thing, and the Kafkas of the world and technologies around that. So what is it left that Dataverse tries to deal with? I think what is left to deal with, at least at this point in time, is the scale of complexity. Scale of complexity in managing diverse points of origin of the data. The data doesn't come from just one system or two systems or one domain or two domain, but it comes globally, accessible ubiquitously from any organization that you have a partnership with, any ecosystem within your organization, outside of your organization. It comes from many different systems, many domains. And most importantly, our aspirations around data has become a lot more complex than reporting or a few statistical models in very niche areas of maybe some, finance department or some areas of sales. And we're really seeing embedding this kind of diversity in terms of how we want to use data. So then with that complexity, there is the speed of change that comes with it, the growth, and Dataverse tries to address this complexity. So again, the focus is mainly analytical data. Analytical data is the data that data scientists and data analysts use. They're usually doing some sort of a past kind of retrospective analysis of what the trends has been and looking at the dashboards and the reports, or making predictions, making recommendations, identifying patterns that help with future decisions, right? And it ranges really from any reporting to machine learning model training. And the nature of the data itself is different from the data that sits in your application databases and runs your business. The nature of the data is that it is temporal. You're always looking at everything that has happened in the past as well as the current state. So being able to see a long, kind of almost infinite view of the past history is an intrinsic characteristic of data. It has to reflect the business. Often, of course, the data and the way we model the data, of course, we attempt to reflect the reality, right? This quote about all the models are wrong, but they're useful. Usually how we model the data is an approximation of the reality, but that approximation is optimized for a very specific use. When you talk about operational databases, it's optimized for performing transactions really fast based on an e-commerce application access or based on an order management access, right? Based on how those applications are designed. When we look at the analytical data, of course, the source of the data comes from those operational touch points, but we try to model the data to closely reflect the business because we're going beyond the bound of a single application data. We're looking really globally and to be able to correlate these signals that we see from these applications. Data is still going to have a large scale. We're still talking about infinite logs and also across many applications, many domains, and it's everywhere. We can't really localize it to one domain or one area. So how have we managed this analytical data? How have we satisfied the needs of the analysts and scientists. This is what we've done in the past. So in the past, we've had kind of this big separation between operational data, data sitting in the application, transactional databases sitting in the application stores. We moved towards more of a microservices over time, and every service manages its own data, its own schema. And we have a very diverse set of technologies on that end, right? Anything from graph databases to document stores to relational databases. However, when it came to analytical use cases, then we said, okay, let's set up this kind of spaghetti of data pipelines and extract and all, transform and move this data to some sort of a centralized place so we can do this cross correlation of the data across the organization. And we moved to, early on to this, from the 60s and 70s, from this warehouse model that we perfectly model data in a way that we can run all sorts of queries on it very effectively, to the model that in the 2010s to say, okay, let's not do that heavy modeling up front. Let's just dump the data in its semi-raw format, and then we do the modeling on the back end of that if we need to. And then let's unleash our data scientists to this kind of file-based, semi-structured storage of the lake. So then we had warehouse, then after that we had lake. And on top of that, usually we have the data governance as a semi-centralized function itself as well, to say, okay, we still have these noble objectives of having secure, compliant, easily accessible, high quality data at organizational level on top of it. So that's kind of where we were before kind of data mesh came to the picture. And the reason data mesh was kind of introduced was because we start seeing these failure modes with, at least with our clients, which are a very good sample of representatives of organizations globally. These are the failure modes. I mean, we start seeing that for analytical use cases where organizations struggling to onboard more sources, struggling to onboard more use cases, that usually the solution is let's build the next data platform. And that goes into this failure to bootstrap for years of investigating, okay, which cloud, which vendor, and to do a few POCs, but they usually have difficulty to take off. And finally, hard to materialize value from data, right? Hard to compete based on data. So, and the main thing that data mesh tried to question was this, that do we really need to centralize the governance, the ownership, the transformation, the serving of the data? And I know I'm overly simplifying when I say centralized or monolithic, because if you look inside it, or many people are at work and probably, the architecture is less monolithic, but organizationally, we have outsourced data to the data part of the organization. And this is just simply by the virtue of being centralized and monolithic is a blocker, right? So this is what data mesh questions. And what we say is that let's accept the reality. I mean, we are at this inflection point that businesses are not getting less complex, we're getting more complex. The sources of data are expanding, the use cases are proliferating. Let's take that as a default position and say, okay, how do I need to shift my approach architecturally, organizationally, and fundamentally technology as well, because technology serves a paradigm and architecture in a way that despite the complexity and scale, we can still get value from data, we can still be agile, and we can still be immune to change. So that's just accepting that dynamic nature and acceleration of change as a fact, as a starting point, and work with the grain as opposed to against the grain. And if we just think about it for a minute, I think a lot of us have, even though we know that's the reality, our processes and our technologies and our approach is against that reality. It's about control of that reality, which never works. So data mesh has these 4 principles. If I summarize it quickly, the first principle is, okay, if you need to decouple and decompose this problem of data, starting with data ownership and then sharing of the data, how can we decompose it? And the way we have, the hypothesis is let's decompose it the same way that business decomposes itself so that it can scale. And let's follow the footsteps of paradigms like microservices, like, distributed architectures we saw in operational systems, which is about aligning technology and business together. Let's extend that to data. What happens if our teams in the domains, in the business domains, who are running the technology for that business can also share data for analytical use cases? As a side effect of that, the bad things can happen, right? Data siloing, all of those problems. So the second pillar is about changing both technology and approach so that data is not an asset, constrained to a particular domain. Data becomes a product that gets shared out of domains for the purpose of the domain and also other domains to use it. And there is a whole set of kind of technology roles and incentives around that. And we've done 2 seminars before on data ownership and data as a product. The third principle is addressing really the concern around the increased cost of running these data products within domains and decreasing that by lowering the responsibility of those teams when it comes to managing infrastructure, and really talks about, it is an extension of what we are already doing, which is abstracting the complexity of running data infrastructure to the next level so that this concept of the data as a product can be easily created and shared with the minimum cognitive load, minimum specialization. So it's a platform that allows generalist technologies become data product developers, become data product consumers. And finally, the topic we talk today is about, in this decentralized world, how do we assure that data is still secure? How do we assure that new problems that arise, which is interoperability of the data, how can I still have a possibility of understanding customer when it had an interface with my website and put a shopping cart, add some items to their shopping cart, that customer still can be followed when I look at their order and the status of the order. So this correlation of the data across different domains, and we will talk about that principle today. So for people who like to visualize this a little bit from, I guess, architecture point of view, we still have that analytical and data plane, but they are integrated very differently. They're integrated around domains. So we have still applications, microservices. Adjacent to those, we have this collaborating kind of architectural units of architecture. We use the word architecture quantum, which means basically units of architecture that has all of the pieces it needs to do its job. And in this case, its job is providing an analytical view of the data that microservice perhaps generating as a byproduct of doing its job and serving that to the rest of the organization. How do we do that? We will have a webinar on this in October, I believe, on the infrastructure piece that, well, we need to think about this infrastructure as a planes of activities or capabilities. And we will cover that. That goes beyond the utility. That goes beyond, I have a Databricks cluster, I have a Snowflake. These are really utility level, fantastic technologies where we need to go above and beyond that and see, okay, how can we abstract or provide those utilities to provide a better experience or less frictionful experience for our developers. And again, governance really manifests itself as a set of global policies that get embedded into every data product and enabled by the platform. And this is, let's double click into that a little bit. But the reason these 4 principles exist is really to summarize is that we want to decentralize the problem into smaller pieces and integrate them in a different way so that we can move faster, so that we can localize change to the domains, so that we can handle that continuous change and continuous growth. But we use the data product to prevent siloing. We use the platform to empower the domains. And most importantly, we use this model of governance to make sure there's increased engagement, make sure that the domains don't become isolated, do whatever they want in a way that doesn't interoperate with anything else, and it doesn't comply with regulations that we have to kind of follow. And also, allow interconnectivity of the data products. At the end of the day, the value usually that we get from data, which is not from one isolated piece of data in one system, it's really about correlating and meshing the data across different domains. So what is this federated competition? And if I could sneak in another word, I would have put embedded in there in general, and I think Jason will do a great job telling all us, including myself, educating myself, what governance is about. But my understanding really is about the outcome or the objective of the governance is making sure that high quality data that is accessible, that is compliant, that is secure, is available across the organization. So data mesh takes that noble objective and outcome as a North Star. We still want to achieve those outcomes. But now we live in a funny world. Now we live in a world that is not that one team or one department or one technology or one lake or many lakes even can manage that data. Now this data is managed very decentrally. So then we can't really try to put a straitjacket around it. We can't have a team of people going in with kind of maybe carrots and sticks and try to make people to do the right thing. So how can we enable people to do the right thing? And how can we make sure doing the right thing is going to make people's lives so much easier? And this is what we really have done in the past with operational systems. Like when we moved from kind of monolithic IT and monolithic kind of applications to more cloud, more microservices, we shifted architectural governance very differently, right? We talk about policy as code. We talk about policy embedded into the services. It's the same shift that needs to happen with kind of data mesh. So the challenge of governance in data mesh is really finding this equilibrium between the common good, as in we want to have some form of a centralized standardization, right, that allows these data products to talk to each other, allows someone who comes to the mesh actually understands different data products, but yet allow kind of individualism of each domains to move fast. So decentralization and centralization equilibrium. So the things that it needs to embrace is that, well, domain's going to have a lot of autonomy. So the governance cannot possibly try to control every domain. So we have to like step back and say, okay, first and foremost, we've got to give domains and these data teams autonomy to model the data, to push the data out to, kind of production for use analytical data. Second, they can't just do that at the cost of kind of friction and lack of interoperability or lower understanding of the data. So then it's a set of global policies and standards need to enable that interoperability. Third, any approach we chose have to accept this as a starting point, that this is a very, very dynamic world. Data, the moment we publish the data set, probably its schema is going to change. The data itself is constantly changing because we said it's a temporal data, right? New events, new refreshed views or, timestamp data is arriving. So either the data itself is changing or the model is changing or our understanding of the data is changing. So all of that needs to be incorporated in how we implement governance. And finally, we're talking about a new generation of data platforms. So let's harness that. Let's harness the ability of embedding execution of policies into every one of these data products that not only have the data itself, but also have a computational context. They have an environment within which you can execute automatically policies. So that's kind of the foundation of it. And really, at the moment, this is an area that we need to really develop together. But the starting point that we have is really an operating model, which says, well, we've got to get people engaged from the domain. So we have to have some form of a understanding of like, who are the people, who are the stakeholders here, and have them engaged in concerns that globally applies to all of the data products. So in this case, of course, we will have the legal team or security team and other SMEs, but the data product owners from the domains have a big role in the governance because they need to have incentives that are aligned with global policies as well as their local incentives like the growth of the data users and so on. Also, we've got to define what are the values that are guiding what's governance need to, or the global governance need to concern itself with, and the things that it shouldn't. So there is a set of guiding principles such as, push governance left, like push the control and accountability lower to the people, right to the source, right? To the people who are most able or capable of implementing those because they are as close to the source as possible. They have control over the life cycle of the data, essentially, right? So do that as early as possible. So these are kind of some of the principles that you need to apply. And what comes out of it is a set of policies that we think should be applied globally to all of the data products. I mean, I don't think the global governance of this operating model should concern itself how order management models its orders, because they know they're dealing with orders. They know the facts and reality of what an order looks like, but it should concern itself how orders and customers and sales and all of these other domains, what modeling language they use to model their data. So if a data scientist comes and looks across 3 domains, they don't have to learn 3 different modeling languages. So they can use just the modeling language that is native to them. But the modeling of the data pushed in. So those policies get defined, policies get automated by the platform capabilities, because at the end of the day, platform is defining the blueprint and executing the blueprint of a data product. And gets embedded into that policy as code, gets embedded into each every data product, because that's the most fine-grained place to enforce a policy. So then you can enforce a policy right at the point of access, right at the point that the data gets read or the data gets used, right? So that's the most fine-grained place that, and because of data mesh architecture defines this data product quantum as an architectural unit, that is physically possible, right? So let's look at this with an example. We might say, okay, we want to standardize what lineage information, execution lineage, what data I consumed, what data I processed, and what data I provided as a data product. We want to standardize that all of the data products emit information about their execution lineage. And not only that, we have to standardize how this lineage gets encoded, what structure we use to describe it. Otherwise, we can't really stitch this lineage information together, right, across the mesh. So that becomes a policy around governance, because again, it works with interoperability, affects interoperability. The platform goes, okay, I need to automate this. How can I do this? How can I enforce this policy or apply this policy across the world? So platform builds a component within a data product, a sidecar, for example, that by default emits this information. And that sidecar, that capability gets embedded into every data product. So every time a single data product processes a new data set, that is structured log gets captured and gets then shared with the platform to be available at the global level, right? And again, these are nothing novel and new here. We've done this in the operational world. We just have to bring those concepts to the data world. So this last slide meant to kind of surprise you a little bit, to make you raise your eyebrows, that these are some of the shifts that need to happen. First of all, the governance team cannot be a centralized, separate third party. We cannot outsource the quality of data to someone else. We cannot outsource modeling post-mortem to someone else, right? It has to really move, the responsibility need to move, shift left into the domains, and again, there's a federated team that's responsible for all of that. And then, the governance team is not responsible for data high quality or security. They're responsible for defining what constitutes quality, what constitutes security, based on the kind of the legal needs and kind of the nature of the business. But it's really the domain teams that are accountable and responsible for implementing that. And it's the platform team that's responsible for making that possible in an automated fashion. Again, I see a lot of, I'm not saying this is universal. Companies and businesses are very different, but I have seen this post-mortem data modeling these days, like kind of knowledge graphs and ontologies are being resurfaced again. And it's wonderful. Of course, we need to have a modeling of the data, understanding of the modeling, but that happens too late at the end. Once we dump the data into the warehouse lake, now we try to model it post-mortem. So that modeling really becomes a responsibility of the domains. What becomes a responsibility of a more global governance is that how do we model things that these different entities interlink and connect? So the ideas of the linked data and the linked schemas is a concern that governance want to standardize, must standardize, right? It goes beyond the responsibility of a single domain. And again, I've seen kind of success metrics set by some of the governance teams, which are based on the volume of the data. That many tables are golden certified data sets that we use. And I don't think that's the right measure of success. The right start kind of leading indicators of success, it should be aligned with, are we getting value from data? Do we have users for this data? And on the mesh, defining, I guess, the leading indicator for getting value is about seeing actually there are data products that talk to each other. Well, I have across this mesh data product that use other data products data, and they're delivering data for the users. So counting the usages and counting the links between the data products, that should be the first leading indicator of success. That when we get started, we should track. So if you're interested in this, a little plug, I guess, for the book. I left the code for you so you can access the book for early release for free. The few chapters out, the governance chapter will be out soon to access. So I guess I pause here. I took a fair bit of time to go to Chris.
No worries, Zhamak. I think it's good that you take the time to set that frame so that everyone's clear in what we're talking about. So what I thought I might do next, so Zhamak, obviously you come from the world of data mesh and applying the lessons that we've learned from microservices and other operational architectures to data domain and trying to solve some of the problems of scale of complexity you mentioned. I'm interested now maybe to veer a little bit towards Jason and his point of view, because I think your professional background is a little bit different, Jason, and I think hearing your angle on this, I think there is a common ground and overlap, but I think that maybe the data governance community is starting from a different place than the software development community when coming to this topic.
I think.
Yeah.
Oh, please.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Oh, thank you, Chris, and Zhamak, as always, that was brilliant. So from the point of view of data governance, and I don't want to speak for the entire data governance community, there's a joke that I've heard at almost every data governance conference. If you have 3 data governance people in the room, you'll have 5 different opinions about anything related to data governance. So what I'm going to share is my own humble opinion, right? I'm not going to try to represent the data governance community as a whole, because that would be impossible. But as I was furiously taking notes, watching Zhamak's presentation, and I've seen Zhamak present in other webinars, the one thing that comes to mind, which is not unusual, is a assertion that data governance is kind of slow moving, plodding, and maybe lacks the finesse to contribute anything to, let's say, anything in a distributed architecture, right? And actually, there's been a lot of movement since the entire migration to cloud. So just as a perspective, I've been doing this for 30 years, which is a very long time. And when I started, yes, it was manual, it was on paper, it was anything but agile, and it was very regulatory driven, right? The regulatory driven is still one of the primary motivations for wanting to engage in data governance. And it's also one of the reasons why there's still this thin slice of governance, ideally, that in practice, not so much, but ideally in a textbook, there is a thin slice of governance that touches everything because data is an enterprise asset, right? For example, governance, risk, and compliance, which is usually the starting point, at least in financial, the financial vertical. We see a lot of issues around data sovereignty and compliance, especially lately with the explosion in the United States of localized data sovereignty issues like California Consumer Protection Act and the other various states that are copying the CCPA. That is still needed, and that is still something beyond making data products. That is also something that is existentially to protect the organization from making a regulatory misstep. So data governance in that sense, when we say what is the primary purpose of data governance, which I'm separating from data management, and I'll explain that in a second. Data governance is there to ensure trust and reuse of trusted data. And also, there's lots of data governance people on here, so they'll probably say, hey, you stole that from me. But the right data to the right person at the right time is kind of what we're doing. Just one more step back into the regulatory GRC stuff. So there's a triad that InfoSec uses: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Those are data security legs of the stool that make up data assurance, right? And data governance uses a lot of those same things. In fact, there's a lot of overlap between what data security does and what data governance does, and they mostly intersect on the compliance level. So I'm going to stop right there for a second, and then I'm going to start addressing some of the other things. But I wanted to see if there are any questions or any comments before I continue. So I know I just leveled a lot there.
I might make a comment as a governance civilian, so to speak, which is, sure. It sounds like when you were talking about regulation being something that needs to map to some kind of global governance in the company, that's because that responding to that regulation is not local value. It's value that cannot be reduced or devolved to a particular area. Because I think, as you could tell from what Zhamak said earlier, Data Mesh aims to push decisions and value as close as possible to the people who know what they're talking about and have that local knowledge. But exactly. I guess regulatory compliance is a case where as close as possible, it's still a global concern because it's the global viability and continuance of the enterprise that is at stake there.
I think it's a nice way to put it. The other way to put it is, if we're talking about the old-timey racy charts where you have the responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed, the accountable is the person that is labeled and has to sit in the dock and answer for whatever happened, and also is the one that goes to jail and the one that gets fired, right? So that accountable in the racy, who is ultimately accountable for all the GRC mishaps, is probably in reality, or if they have any common sense, is probably not going to let that go too far down the food chain without some central control, without some. But we're also seeing that there's a move toward a more of a light touch governance where, and let me say, what has governance been influenced lately? I would say in the last 10 years, in the movement to distributed like cloud type implementations, we're seeing that there's a lot less need for governance to govern every technical artifact, right? So back in the old days, yes, every column, every field, every whatever, every data set would be part of some decision-making authority within the governance organization, right? But that's less so because of, and I say this with a lot of irony because a lot of data governance people say it's not about technology. In this case, it kind of is though. So because of the tools that are offered in these distributed environments like Google Cloud, Azure, Amazon, I'm trying to be agnostic to whatever cloud platform is your favorite because I don't want to start any online arguments. But there are processes that allow us to have the artifact check and see if it's conformant with a centralized policy, right? So we're kind of getting past the days where we have direct intervention by the DGO on any particular data product, right?
So as a non-governance person, let me interpret that just also maybe on behalf of the audience. It sounds like you're saying that maybe against some of the stereotypes of governance functions, there is already a trend, nothing to do with data mesh, but there's already a trend towards governance by rule and by automation rather than governance by control and inspection of individual artifacts or data sets and things like that. That's something that modern data governators are already thinking about in order to respond to the cloud computing world that has existed for some time?
Yeah. As a governance practitioner, I don't want to go too far off the grid and say we don't do any auditing. There's a conformant and observability plane in governance, right, where there's continuous feedback and monitoring of data. But and probably most of the data governance people recognize this name, Chris Bradley. He said that, and I quote, "Any idiot can monitor data quality, but our mission is to improve data quality." Right? I like that quote, and he's a Dama fellow, so he's been around even longer than I have, which is saying something. So I think we're starting to rely more on automated monitoring processes, much like our friends and cousins in the data security, data assurance field, where that used to be a very hands-on, laborious process, very intrusive. And back in the day, if you remember, any of you who were around 15, 20 years ago, remember the onerous data security people who would constantly be overlocking and over torquing security and making work very much impossible to do. That has changed. If you notice, you log in and you are secure, unless you're doing something crazy, and you're locked down. You're all secure, and it's not intrusive. So data governance is slowly kind of following that defense in depth, well, kind of governance in depth, right? So we're trying to say, hey, look, here's the baseline that we all agreed to, because this is the regulatory environment in which we are here. Here are also the principles on which we base data governance, because these align to the business objectives of the organization. When I mean business, I mean anything that delivers value to its constituents. So I mean public sector and private sector. So whatever that thing is, whether it's health benefits, police department, whatever, a widget, those things that generate revenue or generate value for their constituents, they have objectives, and the principles on which we base governance should align to those objectives. So yes, I'm agreeing that we are less invasive than we used to be. Are we completely there and on autopilot? No, right? Because there are things that require something called data ethics, and that's very difficult to automate that, right? Very, very difficult. So how data is used in practice and whether we are safeguarding and stewarding with the utmost diligence the data to which we are entrusted, that is something I think still requires a human touch, right?
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So I have one last distinction to pick up that I think you mentioned it briefly, but I think it's quite important when it comes to connecting the data governance world back to data mesh and what Zhamak was talking about, which is, I think you distinguished between data governance and data management and technology governance. What did you mean by that? What separates those different things?
Say that one more time. I'm sorry.
So I think you distinguished between data governance and data management.
Yes.
Could you explain what that distinction is? Because I think that distinction might be interesting to compare and contrast with the data mesh approach that Zhamak mentioned.
Sure. So that distinction has been around for a very long time, but in the literature, it often gets kind of mushed together, right? So when we see things like even within data governance, some of the articles like data governance operating models. Well, actually, when you look at the players inside the data governance operating models, the only thing about data governance that's in the operating model is the policies and roles and responsibilities and the decision-making bodies that have been identified, right? The actual carrying out of the operating model is done by the data management functions. For example, our good old friends at data security. That is a data management function. That is not a data governance function, right? Data governance is the policy, standard guidelines, and procedures and principles around that. And from that, data security is consulted and informed on what it should do, right? Same with data quality management. So data quality all by itself gets its policies and direction from data governance, but itself, data quality managers are on the data management side. So what does that all mean? Well, okay, so in the big picture, you basically have IT, information technology services, and then all the people that IT enable, which would be on their value generating side. Because I was asked at Thoughtworks, by the way, fun fact, I was never asked to define what the business is until I got to Thoughtworks, right? What do you mean by the business? I mean, anybody not in IT that's busy generating value for an organization, right? That's what I mean. But in the shorthand, in governance world, in the almost 30 years since I got to Thoughtworks, before I got to Thoughtworks, nobody ever asked me that. Just, it was assumed business, okay, not IT, right? But so IT enables, IT are the technical people that carry out some of those data management functions, but not only do, for example, data quality managers who are on the IT side not really own the thresholds, that is, what are the dimensions of data quality we're talking about? Those are set by the business, and then those are encoded into policy and standards by data governance, and then those are carried out by data managers, maybe in semi-autonomous teams within data mesh, right? But somewhere somebody is saying, what does the business actually need to get its job done, to generate revenue, to generate value, to work with its constituents? So usually data governance is thought of, and in practice, in my many decades of doing this, I've always found myself stuck in the IT department. I'm like, but we're a business function, right?
Right.
Today you're not, you're an IT man, and you need to figure out how to get out of there. So I need my business champion. So in real life, it's a lot messier than it is in a book, or than it is in some white paper I might generate. Yeah, so reality is, it's kind of a mess. There's also a big intersection between what was just said right now and your maturity level, right?
Yeah.
So if you come in and you're barely aware, everybody does data governance, you're just not aware they're doing it. And that's ad hoc, and that's pretty low level maturity. To get to where you can have semi-autonomous teams that understand what the guide rails are to what they're doing, that takes a more mature organization that's self-aware of the value of data, and it's self-aware of its own capacity and capability to manage that data. Right.
So what I'm hearing as an IT person, if I dare say that, who might end up in the same part of the organization as you for reasons that may not be good. What I'm hearing you say is that pure data governance shouldn't be something that involves micromanaging of implementation. It should be about guidelines, policies, etc., that set constraints and explain what good looks like. And that,
and the micromanaging part is just for our own survival, right? So if you look at any organization that decides, oh, you know what, this data governance stuff, that's not a bad idea. We're going to hire 1 or 2 people to manage 80,000 employees and their data. So you got to pick the hill you're going to die on, right? So you have to be very, very strategic with how you're going to marshal whatever meager resources you have to fight the good fight. And usually that is around, hey, look, we need to set up decision-making bodies, right? I can't go worry about what Team X is doing with this data. I don't have time to do that because there's just a couple of me and there's thousands of them. So the only way I can do this is enabling the organization to create these decision-making bodies and take it out of my hands and put it in something like a data council. So a data council would be the interface between some C-suite person and the data governance office, which may be centralized or decentralized. It really depends on the cultural fit of the organization, how decisions are made. That's our primary litmus test. How are decisions made in the organization? that tells us what kind of data governance organization should be there, right? From there, then you have, in old-timey language, we call them data stewards. I think they have a new label now. And those folks are interacting on day-to-day. They're the subject matter experts. And again, those persons already exist. We just have to find who they are, right? And then they kind of champion the standards within whatever teams are out there operating. So in real life, there's virtually no organization that I'm aware of that is, I'm sure there are, so just that I'm aware of. I want to make sure I make that clear, that I'm aware of. Where micromanaging of teams and data standards and policies and stuff, or all that occurs. I'm not aware of any company that has over torqued the staffing on data governance so high that they even have the capability of doing that.
Right. I might use that opportunity to flip back to Zhamak's angle, actually, because you mentioned, like Jason, that challenge that people have who, in a governance function, who are effectively overwhelmed by the sheer size of the organization they're trying to serve. And as you pointed out, Zhamak, the increasing complexity of the data that is flowing through that organization. Would I be right in thinking, Zhamak, that a way to deal with that pressure and that scale is one of the things that data mesh really has to offer to people who come from the governance world?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, going back to that inflection point, I think we've got to accept that the governance concerns are not going to go away. Like the phrase Jason used, right data to the right user at the right time. I mean, that's why we're here even talking about data. So that's not going to go away. Kind of the legal responsibilities of individuals in the organization and that central accountability, who's going to get fired, that probably not going to change either. So with those constraints and characteristics of the environment, how can make this getting data to the user at the right time, to the right user at the right time, real, effective? I mean, I have all the empathy for the, small data governance team and data stewards that try to actually make this possible. So data mesh exactly tries to do that. Let's make it real. Let's shift left. Let's shift to the teams. Those policies. Let's absolutely make it #1 requirement of the platform that gets embedded again in every data product. I mean, there is a thing that we didn't talk much here. We talked about in the data as a product, that we've got to shift our thinking about what data is anymore. Like, data is not just bits and bytes or tables or files. Data product is the data and the lively code that maintains that data, that the code that assures the policies are possible. So if we accept that as a shift in organization, then it's all about making what Jason said real at scale in a complex environment. And that goes beyond just setting the policies. That extends to, I suppose, what Jason mentioned, data management. I think it extends to, how do I author the policies in that mode, in a scale? How do I apply the policies at a granular level at scale? So it kind of, I guess, data governance best buddies are in data platform team, as well as the domains.
I think this would be a really good opportunity to bring in a question that Javier Granda asked, because I think so far the discussion for a lot of the case has been fairly abstract. And what Javier asked was, could you give us a real world example of a governance policy being embedded and used in a platform? I think a concrete example might help people to picture what this would look like. That's
a really good point. Yeah. So privacy levels, for example, are some of the governance concerns, right? In healthcare, depending what domain you are, different data products have different levels of privacy. Require different levels of encryption, access control, who can access the data, and so on. And it's not binary, it's more complex in analytical data, that this binary of, this group of data scientists can access or can't access. It's more like, they can access maybe these fields, maybe they can access the statistical information of the data, applying differential privacy, but they can't access individual fields, individual records. So that defining the privacy rules governing a particular data product, and also access control rules, I assume it falls into the governance policies, right? So then how do we embed it? So the way we went about it, that we work with the SMEs, data security, data governance folks, and say, okay, what are the privacy levels that we want to implement for our data products? And we define a set of rules and set of privacy levels. Then what we did was, as part of the data product blueprint, the code that, the configuration of the code that defines what the data product is, and what rules govern it, and how to impose those rules, that code and configuration became a capability of the platform. So we had a language or a configuration, or DSL, a domain-specific language for defining these policies, and started fairly easy, like level 1, level 2, level 3, and then kind of matured over time. That configuration became part of the configuration of the data product. And then the platform itself, again, data product is code and data. I keep repeating that. The platform itself implemented a bunch of capabilities that when you generate a new snapshot of your data, encryption happens right then and there in the code. So as you read, access control gets enforced. So this, as you read a particular data product, independent of all the other ones, as you write, encryption happens. So all of the technical capabilities were kind of implemented there. Not only that, the tests and validations, I mean, data mesh, again, inherits and follows a lot of the techniques and practices in software engineering. Fast feedback loop is so important. So as part of our CI/CD pipeline of a data product, we would have tests and validations that is the code, the data that is writing or the data that is reading is enforcing the policies at the right time. And then on top of that, you have observability in the platform that is constantly kind of scanning and making sure that the data products have the right policies. So that was one of the examples, one of the early kind of policies, which was privacy.
I think it's a privacy or PII status just is a really compelling thing because it's so critical to businesses. Especially with things like GDPR, and I guess it's so tractable for a computational approach.
Yeah, and I think that if we say what would be an alternative to this, what would have happened in the past? In the past, often, your data kind of makes it out of the application's databases through some pipelines, get dumped somewhere, and then we try to apply these policies to it. Then we try to make it a golden standard secure, and we buy, a governance tool and try to continuously consolidate this data that is being done or designed in the warehouse with the governance view of it overlaid over it. So it happened later in the pipeline, and it happens kind of after the fact, and the feedback loop is much slower back to the source who should be really implementing this right then and there when the data gets generated.
This might be an interesting point to flip back to Jason to contrast, actually. So I think what I heard, Zhamak, was this example you gave, you talked about different privacy levels and maybe some requirements like encryption that are associated with certain sensitivity. But you also talked about the data mesh approach fitting with what the platform provides, which might make it easier for teams to do the right thing without too much hassle. It seems to me, Jason, when I look at it, that the data governance you spoke about would be, from a business point of view, mostly concerned with defining those privacy levels and what is appropriate to do with that kind of data, and that pure data governance wouldn't necessarily get involved with supplying technical tools to make teams' lives easier to do it, because that might come from some other function. Have I correctly interpreted that distinction there?
Yeah, I think at a pretty primary level, yes, right? So data governance as a practice, right? And there's different flavors of it, and certainly with, like I said, cloud platforms, DG is evolving rapidly, but there's a lot of automation now because of new tooling. So I don't want to say you can just govern with tools. That is still not true, but you can have processes in place. You can have standards and which emanate from policies, which emanate from principles. You can have all those stated very clearly. In fact, there was a question how in the chat, how can people figure out what those policies are, well, that would be your data stewards should be able to help you in there. And there's a whole issue escalation thing that we could spend an entire thing talking about. In regards to how do we know that things are conformant? Well, there is processes in place within, I'm assuming data mesh, and then in other distributed architectures that work on that observability conformance plane to check constantly, doing a feedback and modification and or being allowed or not allowed based on its conformance to whatever policy and standard is outlined. Usually it's not the policy, usually it's a standard that emanates from the policy. The policy is in governance speak, is a very short, brief, stated up front document. It just is really the authority to operate, right? And it says, here's all the decision-making bodies that inform this policy. Here's all the standards and procedures that emanate from this policy. You're going to comply with one of those, right? So I don't think anybody, I mean, yes, I suppose there are some pretty basic policies that one would conform against, but usually it's the standards that emanate from the policies that are measured against, right? And yeah, you're right. There are automated ways to measure that. Much like, for example, the way endpoint security and networks can check to see if your machine and your setup is conformant with security policy to access, or group policies for IAM, for example. In much the same way, we could do that with data now. So hopefully that answered the question.
Cool. Yeah, thanks very much. So I might move on to a question that Bruno Moyle asked, which was if we have any tips for dealing with MDM/golden record approach. He goes on to explain like how to help domains not to have duplicated entities, for example, customers' data. And I wondered, maybe Zhamak, how you felt data mesh might think about this particular problem.
Yes. Good news is that I don't really have to answer this question because we answered it in the last webinar. So if you go to, for a longer version of this answer, if you go to Thoughtworks webinars, we had one on domain ownership for data mesh, which was our previous webinar, and we actually expand on how master data management is done. But in short, I want to pick a few words in that, which was golden data record, copying data, and then master data like customer. So with data mesh, the need of, let's focus on the need of master data management in a way. The need and the objective, I mean, outside of data mesh, as defined by Dharma, is really having access to a consistent data about core entities of the business that span multiple domains. So in this case, you mentioned customers, so it spans multiple domains. And in the past, again, there are different approaches and different architectures, but generally they fall into this pattern that we're going to get data from all of these domains. We're going to harmonize it. We're going to create a view that caters for all different facets of this entity, and then we're going to put it somewhere. And it has a lot of challenges, that approach. As a starting point, assuming that there is one model that is the unified model of the customer, I think that's flawed, because that one model, maybe you define it, but its model would be very probably useless for most people that want to use that model. Because, and we talk about that in our last webinar, because the perception and what a domain or what a single function wants from that model, the need, how that needs to be modeled for them is very different. If I'm a customer at the time of receiving my order versus the customer at the time of putting my order through, these are very, very different attributes of me that the domains care about. So data mesh accepts this and says a few things. One is, in fact, domains can have their own definition of the customer based on what customer means to them. That's perfectly fine. And if there are domains that need to refer to customer in another domain, they would do so by linking to the model of the customer defined by another domain, by linking to the entity of the customer defined in another domain. And this is really based on the idea of, again, if you want to decentralize solving the harmonization problem, that's what web does, right? We link to each other. So the idea of, and these ideas have been introduced with kind of semantic web, again, reintroduced by GraphQL folks. So it's been reintroduced, this idea of linking data and linking a schema a few times. So we can adopt the same similar model. So instead of having one unified model, have multiple models, but have the context mapping expressed through the links between them. So you don't have one customer, you have many customers, but these customers link to each other. And then the part that then is really important is not that every attribute we have exactly the same attributes, but it's that the attributes that allows us to correlate one customer to another, which at minimum is the idea, how do we identify customers? That's the one we really need to unify. And that's how we say, okay, as part of this every data product, these polysemes, I think it was one of the items maybe on the slide I didn't go through, the identities that cross different boundaries, we're going to have a unique ID. And in fact, this is how probably it's done in the business anyway, you're identifying your customers somewhat uniquely, but then the system implementations have their own IDs, and we're going to have to do a mapping. One other thing, so linked data, linked schemas with unique IDs that allows us to stitch them together in terms of the data itself, and the unique IDs of the schemas as well. Like every schema should be an addressable entity. Every data product is an addressable entity. And the last point is the point you made about duplication. In fact, duplication is not a bad thing. So let's talk about that. I know I lost everyone. I made a bunch of, so far we made a bunch of friends, and now everybody turned into enemies. Michael Blake says. So let's unpack that, right? Data in data mesh is read-only immutable. Data never updates. So I know that can be a bit controversial. Now I've opened a complete can of worm, and I look at the clock, so we still have 20 minutes, I guess. But the data always represents, and this is a topic the book explores, every data point represents two facts. One is what was the state of the system at the point of observation. So it's always the state of the system at a point in time based on an observation. So you always have the record time, the time that we recorded this information, at the time that this information happened or existed, right? So there's always this bitemporality that's built into the data. So this fear of data gonna get copied and get updated will immediately go away, because data will never get updated. What gets updated is either a time at which an event occurs or a state changes, or a new observation time, right? So the read-only immutable data removes a ton of incidental complexity that comes from updating data. So then the copying is, let's say I am actually a data product domain that makes customer classification. So customers that maybe we need to reach out, or the customers that are loyal to us and we want to embrace. So this classification cohorts of our customers. So for that data product to happen, to exist, it probably copies a fair bit of attributes from customer information from different places and bring it as part of its cohort definition. And that's okay, because what that data product does, again, it represents the state of the customer at a point in time. It always has its input ports that's consuming new data coming. Again, mesh is live. It's continuously receiving that information added, and in maintaining its information. And it always tells the users, when was the last time that I observed this data or I recorded this data? So you know that if you're looking at the state customer address in the cohort versus customer address, let's say in customer registration, and you see different addresses, it's because they belong to two different points in time. So some of those copying is going to get, I know this is a very complex and deep topic, but I think we should do a bit of a soul searching why copying is bad, because data goes stale, data goes out of date, because data doesn't have the long-term ownership to stay alive. And if we do a bit of a soul searching, if we do a 5 whys exercise, we find that data mesh addresses a lot of those concerns, and copying, like the example that I gave you, is not that bad.
Yeah. So basically, I deliberately chose that question because I thought we could steer into territory that would get you controversial with the audience, Zhamak. I've heard, I might actually bring Jason in, who can represent like the data governance angle here. So Jason, so I think I heard 2 things that Zhamak was suggesting that possibly are controversial from a data governance traditional point of view. One is that having multiple models, so not trying to have use governance to tie together a single model or viewpoint of the data of an enterprise. That's one thing that data mesh suggests governance should be comfortable with. And the second is that certain aspects of data quality, maybe if we are more, if we take into account things like immutability, and if we're more modest in our ambition about how we beat the data into shape, we're more likely to be successful. Would it be fair to say that those kind of 2 things that Zhamak pointed to go against the grain, or at least go against some ambitions or goals that data governance people have striven to achieve in the past?
Well, again, I don't want to be the like voice in the wilderness for all things data governance. I will say a couple of things in real life, and okay, I'm probably about to step into a minefield, but I usually see MDM implemented in the wrong order, right? So whenever I hear, hey, there's an MDM thing going on, I'm like, I bet you it's in the wrong order. I bet you somebody bought an MDM tool and now they're implementing MDM, and I bet you there's no roles and responsibilities done. So that's all makes everything mute, or kind of moot about MDM in the first place. In the few times, and I mean few, like as in I can count on one hand in my entire breadth of experience where I've seen MDM successfully implemented, there's been a strong and practiced data governance put into place. It's at least a managed, or 3 or 4 in the maturity level, and there is distributed architecture going on. Also, there's not the rock in the river of holding on to a single source of truth. There are the use of metadata lineage and enterprise data catalogs to create what I like to shorthand is the SQL view of a data asset, right? So in SQL, we have this idea where we create a temporary view of a piece of data that's been, queried in some way, right? It's not what Zhamak said was immutable, but this is more transitory, but it's flagged in data classification, or at least in the data schema, as being transitory. So this is not the single source of truth, is a source of truth for this particular purpose. And we're done, right? And so when we have a customer record and we have a master domain of customer, which to my mind is the most troublesome of the domains to master, because everybody has their own definition of customer and they are very hard to convince otherwise. Sometimes some new reason will pop up as to why we need to enrich all these data to create some unique view to, say, tackle white space in the market or something. We want to try something new and we need some data and we need it in this way to make things happen. It's not a single source of truth. It's a temporary, convenient view of the customer to accomplish some task. So in that way, I agree with what Zhamak said. I also agree that I've been yelled at many times in my career for insisting that you can't have MDM without having some kind of DG practice. And I get told like, nope, you're wrong. We're just going to do this MDM thing and we're going to buy this big MDM product, spend millions, and it'll fix itself. It'll all be okay. That's what I hear. So I got other problems with MDM besides single source of truth, but we'll just leave it at that. I'm sure somebody in the audience has successfully done this and could tell me 28 ways why I'm wrong, but that's just my experience.
Cool. Well, maybe we should schedule another webinar for you to talk about MDM, Jason.
Let me gripe about
MDM.
Yes, let me gripe about it. Yeah.
So what I'm getting actually from both of you there is almost disappointing, close to agreement that I was hoping for, was that things like identifying the customer, or maybe a standard way mechanisms of identification. What does the ID mean? What is that kind of linkage approach that can be used for multiple processes might be something that should be the subject of governance, but the actual kind of nature of the model of the customer might necessarily be different in different domains. And I guess to respond to what someone said on the chat, that would indicate that a single source of truth wouldn't be what you'd be shooting for, because a single perspective that would be necessary to even frame a single source of truth might not be a goal that you're trying to go for. So I think that's our position, and might go against the grain for some things that people on this call have been pushing for in their enterprises. But there you go. You have what we're pushing for.
But the way I would frame it is, I keep changing it, but one framing might be that every data product is a single slice of truth, because they are all truthful, they're all validated to be truthful, but they're just a slice of it.
Cool. That's a nice metaphor. So Jason, you talked about like kind of governance and responsibility as being necessary rather than just installing a tool somewhere. So I wanted to pick up a question that Eniko Ban has asked. I might ask you first, Jason, actually. In a large organization, so more than 20,000 employees, who should own the governance over the data mesh? Enterprise data governance, or business units should own their own pieces of the mesh? Or would it be joint ownership?
Well, so the cop-out answer, which would also be the correct answer, is depends on the organization, right? So if you have a top-down, well, actually, if you had a top-down kind of corporate model, you'd probably be less likely to adopt data mesh in the first place. I don't know. Maybe somebody should do a correlation study between corporate governance and the implementations of data mesh. That would be interesting. But how decisions are made kind of answers that question. So again, if decisions are made using decision-making authorities that are not necessarily based on your job title, but more based on your influence on data, then perhaps by a central authority. If though you find that the central authorities are the decision-making bodies within data management and governance do not really understand what's going on in the distributed architecture that's being implemented, I would say there should still be a central repo of policies and standards, but the ownership should be moved downstream, right? But again, that is a really loaded question, because there is no one right answer to any kind of governance model, any kind of data management model. They're tailored fit to match the decision-making culture within the organization. How decisions are made really influences the principles on which policies are made, and therefore the standards of which come from policies, and then how those are communicated to the folks actually doing the work. Right? I wish I had a really pat answer for that, but it doesn't exist. I could just make one up though, but
I think Eniko knows it's complicated because there's enough caveats in the framing of the question. I think it was deliberately.
Yeah, did I put enough caveats in there? I could add some more.
Yeah. So, Zhamak, do you have an angle on this of who should own the governance, enterprise data governance, or business units with pieces of the mesh?
I put myself on mute. Own data governance. Let's unpack that. What does that question even mean? So if we undefine, let's redefine again. If the governance as an outcome is about making data is available, the trustworthy data and high quality data available to the right person, that breaks down into many different pieces. Some pieces of that is owned and is the responsibility of the data product owners within the business units. And some pieces of that is actually the responsibility of the platform product owners to make sure the platform is enabling them. And some pieces of that is part of the governance global, the centralized global governance function. As an example, defining what constitutes, let's say, quality, if the PP quality as an example, then the central global governance probably should define what does constitute quality. How do we express data quality in a standardized way? Yeah. The ownership of implementing that quality into every data product, making sure that every data product meets those quality metrics and reports those quality metrics, becomes the data product ownership responsibility in the domain. The enablement of give me a platform capability so that I can capture and express these quality metrics, calculate, capture, express data quality metrics becomes a platform accountability. So these are all interplaying. And even that decision around what constitutes quality, I think the team, this is again something we need to kind of work out. I don't think it will be coming upon us from some third party. I think we will have people that know the regulations and the requirements around the data quality, to traditionally data governance folks informing and steering the decision making. And also I think that federated group, the idea of federation was that the domain data product owners are part of that decision making. They are putting their 2 cents in and informing and are part of the decision making, with steering and guidance coming from people that understand that globally across the enterprise, and ultimately are accountable for it. So that question needs to be unpacked to give an answer.
Yeah, I think that I deliberately picked that one because of the word own. I thought was interesting, because I think what we've already kind of moved towards in our discussion is that, you know, governance needs to operate at the same level as the value it's trying to safeguard. So if there is stuff that can be devolved all the way to a data product or a team working on a data product, and they can take full accountability and be in full contact with all the consequences of their decisions, well, then that governance or those just decisions can be made at that level. If the value that's being safeguarded is that the company does not get fined into oblivion because of GDPR violations, then that value needs to be safeguarded at a proportionate level. And so, yeah, like you said, this governance wouldn't be one particular thing. It could be distributed through different levels of the organization, depending on what is trying to be achieved with different parts of governance. So I'm realizing there's tons of questions because everyone loves governance, obviously. I think maybe we should start to cycle around and wind down, because it's not feasible for us to get to all of the questions. I will address kind of a group of questions before we get in that. There was a lot of questions about the state of the art of tooling and what AWS or GCP or Azure or other tools can be used to implement different governance functions. I'm sorry, but I deliberately dodged those questions because I think what we wanted to cover today was more what the process and approach is. I think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Zhamak, like with governance as a whole, data mesh tries to describe what good looks like when it comes to federated computational governance rather than specific implementation strategies. So, there isn't a particular artifact that the data mesh methodology says the governance team must produce, but there is a set of aspirations and values that we expect a governance function in data mesh to achieve. So I deliberately tried to steer away from getting too far into those questions because I think that wasn't the level of abstraction we wanted to have the conversation.
And I think generally what I would say is that none of our tools are perfectly fitting a data mesh paradigm, because all of our tools have been implemented with a very different paradigm that data governance happens later on, happens centrally, even the other tooling in the ecosystem. However, I think we can apply, we have to be pragmatic until the technology catches up. we have to be pragmatic and see, okay, which one of these tools best fits this paradigm, and how can I configure it or slightly use it differently to fit in it. So then my only 2 cents on the data governance tooling selection, whether you're going with your native tool from your cloud provider or an open source or a managed version of something else, think about this idea that a lot of those governance concerns, configuration of policies and enforcement of the policies need to happen at the time of data production. So what does that, and it has to be under the control of that data product and be embedded within the life cycle of build, deploy, test, running, observing a single data product. So that means you expect your data governance tool to allow you in a programmatic way, API-driven way, for a data product to control its policies and execution and so on. And some do more than the other and some don't. And then there is this new category of the governance tools that have come to exist to address kind of band-aid the incidental complexities that they had created. So they come from like a lot of data cataloging tool. If they they fall under the data governance, they come from a place that the world is a bunch of siloed databases that nobody understands. Let me run an intelligent algorithm on top of it and tell you which source you need to trust. So that comes from a place that the intention in building trust right at the source is missing, and we try to retrospectively decide on that based on data usage and so on. Even though that might be a very handy tool when you get started with data mesh, but definitely you don't want to rely on that method, because again, you want to make sure right from the source, the quality is baked in rather than decided further down the track.
You know, all those tools, you can look at the legacy of where they came from to tell you what to look out for. For example, SAP data management, data governance tools have their basis in ERP. Informatica is a set of acquisitions that kind of jury-rig stuff together. Irwin is based in data modeling, right? So when you look at all these tools, you also have to look at not just what their current capabilities are, but where did they come from? Because each tool has its own philosophy of how governance should be implemented, right? And so the bottom line is, if you buy a tool first, you're going to be retrofitting your DG or whatever it is, whether it's data mesh or not. You're going to be wrapped around that tool rather than having the tool wrap around your program. So again, yeah, most people buy the tool first. Let's just be honest. That's what happens. But you're going to be doing a lot of retrofitting, and you're going to be doing a lot of compromising because you bought the tool first. It's like buying a Formula One. Yep, you bought it, but you can't drive it, right?
Speak for yourself, Jason. Anyway, I think that might be a nice point of agreement to end on, because we've hit 7:30 in Central European summertime. So basically, a nice bit of advice at the end there is that whatever you're doing with governing your data, use tools because they're great, but question their assumptions and make sure that the tool is working for you rather than you working for the tool. And I think that applies whether or not you're using data mesh or probably all sorts of architectures as well.
Nice.
Cool. So thank you all for coming along to this conversation about data mesh and how governance relates to data mesh. I hope that you learned something or got a jumping off point that you can use to deepen your understanding of the topic. We really appreciate all the comments and replies and discussion on the chat. Sorry to the people whose questions we couldn't get to. Thank you for asking them anyway. We had to be selective. Just to repeat, the video will be available publicly. It should be, I think, early next week. The dependency on our side is just making sure that we get subtitles added to it and review them for quality to make sure that the recording's accessible. So we'll share that with attendees when we have it. So thank you all very much for attending this webinar in the series of the 4 principles of data mesh. And thank you very, very much, Zhamak and Jason, for lending your expertise and time to have this discussion. It was great.
Thanks for having me.